All right, welcome everybody to a Grupo Solidaridad and our dialogue about trauma and its effects on our world and how we act in our world. And part of what's going on right now is really super difficult to really kind of move through all of these things and try to get a handle on the various dimensions of trauma, the various dimensions of how that affects the way we see the world, how we act in the world, from the different perspectives and the different roles that we play. So we have kind of guiding our discussion and kind of giving it a real frame is one of my most close friends, but also someone that's really kind of gets all this stuff because she's grew up in East Side San Jose, has worked in the East Side, has founded Amigos, so Guadalupe Center for Justice and Empowerment, has a wonderful staff that she grew from very small, but now it's a pretty substantial staff, working with folks that are from the East Side and developing leadership as well as trying to understand the issues around food insecurity, rental insecurity, and literacy and community development. So this is Maritza Maldanado. Many of you know her. But again, the founding director, executive director, and serving now at Amigos, Guadalupe Center for Justice and Empowerment. And she will introduce the rest of the panel. So Maritza. Oops, you're on mute still. Billy, you need to unmute her.
Sorry about that. Welcome, everyone. We're glad that you're joining us today. My name's, as Father John said, is Maritza Maldanado. I think some context to who I am first generation Mexican in this country. Parents are both immigrated from Mexico and was raised in East San Jose and was schooled in East San Jose and went through Alamo School District and also East Side. And so I say that because I was also raised poor and would not have given up that for the world because it really does give you a different perspective of how you see the world. Amigos was born out of the context of how do we make things different for people in East San Jose that continue to be plagued with issues of insecurity around housing and health and education and immigration issues and people that live in the shadows and what that does to people and to people's self-esteem and so really looking at how we were moving Amigos forward and having this conversation with Father John very early on and said, we're not even at the table. And I say this because it put it in perspective for me about what our work, what we're called. Father John said, to hell with their table, we'll create our own. And that's the work of Amigos. It's really about trying to raise up issues of inequity that continue to plague redlining our communities. My parents couldn't even buy a house. No one would lend them money, and so our church started their own credit line for people of color. And so when we put everything that's happening right now with the protests, it's a much bigger issue, right? It starts bringing up things for me around the inequities and righteous anger that I have around that. So that said, I think the issue of trauma, how that plays out in poor communities of color, exhibits itself very differently for us. I live with internalized suppression of all those messages that were giving to me as a young kid. You're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not whatever, right? You're not wealthy enough, you don't have the things that others have. And so I think that context around what people are exhibiting today, and then layer in the oppression and people, classism and racism and homophobia, and how all of those things play out is important. So that said, I'd like to introduce our folks that we're going to, our experts today. Dr. Judy Sanchez. You want to introduce yourself, Judy, and maybe you can introduce Bridget after that, and Bridget, you can introduce Heather.
I don't know how I got you one of your experts because I'm not. My name is Judy Sanchez. I'm on the board from Leaders for County. I practice obstetrics and gynecology. And plants.
Judy, we may be having some bandwidth issues on your side.
Yeah,
I think, Judy, we can't hear you. You're frozen, so maybe she has to either log on or take off her thing. Judy, are you able to continue on?
I don't know. I might go out again. I don't have good in my house or out.
There, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, just stay on audio only, and then you can introduce Heather, and then Heather can introduce, or rather, you can introduce Bridge, and then Bridge can introduce Heather.
Yeah, turn off video.
Okay.
Better.
You can introduce them, maybe, since you have better
We didn't,
connection.
Judy, we didn't hear anything about who you were.
It's fine. Go. You can introduce Heather and
Okay,
Bridget.
We'll edit it out in post.
All right, so Judy is Dr. Judy Sanchez, serves in South County at the works for the county medical, and she works in the clinic down in South County in Gilroy. Gilroy is the it is a community that has actually the highest rate of poverty municipality in Santa Clara County. So it is and she serves that particular community, and has worked in the Latino community for decades. And so the two other panelists are Bridget and Heather. Bridget is the director for, the program manager for a parish engagement project that we have in San Jose, and she is working currently with 8 different communities to work along with our disaster relief recovery services, and we'll be doing that for a while, and then she will be opening up recovery centers, service hubs in the center part of San Jose, which is the center of poverty. And so she has done a lot of work and around the relationship between trauma and poverty, and so is continuing to pioneer some of those research and some of that work here in Santa Clara County. The other panelist is Heather Valentine, and she is a therapist and is also working at staff at Notre Dame High School. She has done has spoken regionally, nationally on different dimensions of poverty. She has a whole series of poverty videos that some of us might have seen on YouTube that were originally intended for her students, but they were such a hit that a bunch of other people were looking at these amazing videos about really how to navigate oneself in a time of difficulty and poverty and all the different social upheavals. She's also very active in the indivisible movement and has is learning to work as a partner and a listener with the community that is most directly affected. Both Heather and Bridget will talk about their own perspectives and how they want to hold themselves throughout this whole conversation. They did want to remind me that they're not experts on the community, but they understand trauma and the dimensions of trauma. So they are not coming as people that kind of know everything about the community, but rather looking at the dimensions of how trauma has affected us in a number of ways, and how we can understand that and to have a more productive conversation as we move forward. So with that, I'll give it to the panelists, and I'll come back at the end with some closing remarks. Maritza?
And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I'd like to just pose, what are the various types of trauma that you can talk to us about?
Sorry,
Who
I
wants
had
to
to
take that?
myself. I'm feeding my child while we're talking here today. So if you hear a little baby cry in the background, that's what's going on. Various types of trauma. So I think when Heather and I were kind of thinking about this presentation and what we wanted to talk about, we really wanted to honor first and foremost that there's a lot of different things going on in the world right now, and that for the past basically 6 months, it's just been a barrage of like one bad thing after another. So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about layers that are currently happening in our lives. And the first of those, the first major one that I can think of is COVID, a major illness that is affecting all of us globally. And while that can be kind of unifying in some senses on a positive side, because we're all going through the same stuff together, it does have worse effects on some communities than it does others. So sicknesses, things like poverty, things like car accidents, things like rape, things like living in a war, having to flee a country, those are all different types of trauma.
Yeah. I guess I would also add on that. On top of that, there's what Bridget is getting at is that there's complex trauma, which is when you have all these different layers. And another layer too is for a lot of the people in our community, you know, there's also the layer of poverty. There's also what's going on in your own home and with your own family. You know, before I mean, I feel like we've been in a crisis for a very long time in the last 4 years, but as you look at things, you know, before COVID hit, people had their own, you know, struggles. So you also have kind of that layer. And as it keeps, you know, adding one layer on top of another, it just makes it more complicated and challenging for people to deal with all the different parts. And I also think the other thing I would just want to throw out there is that everyone has a lot of feelings about everything that's going on. And so I think people are just a little bit more reactive to each other. And I think we're going to get into that in a little bit, kind of how that impacts people.
Great, thank you. I'm just curious, knowing that in East San Jose, we have the largest number of COVID cases. So I just want to follow up around COVID's and closely rising the largest number of deaths as well. What do you two think the long-term effects of that will be for families and children of those in East San Jose that are afraid? And then what do you think or believe we can do as community to uplift or support each other during this time?
Heather, take it away.
You want me to? Okay. Well,
Start.
please jump in. This doesn't have to be formal at all. It's more of I see it as a kind of a conversation. Definitely not an expert on this area, but what I would say is that these are going to be really long lasting on multiple levels. Like, actually, I wanted to ask you, when you said afraid, do you mean afraid from COVID or from political things or poverty or how it's all impacted?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that. You know, prior to COVID's, what we mainly dealt with was trauma or PTSD as well from coming across the border, living in the shadows. You know, right now it's a lot of DACA being rescinded. It's what we're hearing that's going to happen at the Supreme Court. Now there's a lot of fear around COVID, around the administration, and also just the climate of the racial unrest and the righteous anger that people are exhibiting right now around the inequities that continue to plague communities, and it's not just East San Jose, it's all poor communities of color across this nation that we're all dealing with the same thing in a different way, just different communities.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that. And, you know, it's so interesting when I think about this topic. It is so broad. Like everything that you just listed is a real and valid fear and concern that people have, and especially people who are living, as you said, in poverty. Yes, I mean, I'm just going to say it. I know a lot of people on here know me, a lot of people don't, but I've been very active since Trump was elected. And I think that that's kind of not that we all need this lesson, but, or this reminder, but that has started this fear, a real fear of our immigrant communities. I think there's been a lot of fear around ICE on top of that, and ICE raids, and we've seen how that's impacted people. My added fear about COVID is the health risks for people, the economic risks, you know, the economic impact that this is having on people. I think, you know, we have more people who like white collar jobs are able, I think statistically, to do their work more at home, whereas unfortunately people from communities that are more impacted are having to go to work, so putting themselves at greater risk. I think that that's a really important factor to pay attention to. I think that, you know, I don't know about you guys, but when I look at all the COVID information, it's not slowing down, it's ramping up. And, you know, someone said, and it's sad in a way, but like, COVID doesn't care. COVID, the virus, doesn't care why you're out. COVID doesn't care if you're out because you are protesting for the most important thing in your life. There is, you know, some increased risk with that. I think the economic stuff is going to be huge because this is a community that was already struggling, and this is just going to increase. And then maybe I will turn it over to Bridget, so I'm not dominating.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I'm also just seeing that there was a question that popped up from someone regarding ACEs. I'd be happy to speak to that. So kind of circling back to that original question, though, I live in the East Side. I live in Mount Pleasant neighborhood. We've lived here for the last 10 years. And the effects of it are pretty visible already. So, you know, our neighborhood was already going through an overhaul as far as gentrification goes, that when we first moved here, this community was really different, even in just 10 years from where it is right now. And the impacts of that are that you're seeing these houses getting bought up by richer, whiter, more Asian people who have different, better paying jobs, white collar jobs, and you're seeing a lot more people being forced to move out of the valley. So just kind of minding that, and knowing that the poorer residents who are still in our area, we're already going through a really hard time. We're already having a really hard time meeting their monthly bills, their rent, their food, everything else that they needed to buy. What we've been doing at Catholic Charities for the past 3 weeks is conducting a survey. So our goal is actually to get 1,000 people, or a little bit over 1,000 actually, to respond to the survey. And so far we're about a third of the way there. And what we're finding from this study is that there's a lot of longstanding impacts that are going to be around, possibly for multiple generations. And then within a few next months, we're going to see a really, really big change in how San Jose looks in our landscape. And it's not a really good one either. What our respondents are saying is that 45% of them are going to be entering homelessness within the next 3 months. So 120 days after the moratorium is over, they will not be able to pay back their rent, because we're talking about $10,000 or more that they owe, that they haven't been able to pay. They don't have jobs to come back to. And if people stay, if white collar workers don't return to work, actually reporting to work, not just working from home, then all of the supporting jobs are lost. So we know that people are going to suffer in that way. When we're talking about long-standing impacts on the East Side, this has a lot to do with how our kids are growing up. So kids in this district or in this area were already disenfranchised. They were already not doing so great. If you look at our school scores, the school that's behind my house, Robert Sanders, that school is a 2 out of 10. Whereas if you go into one neighborhood, one district over, literally crossing one street over from my house, Evergreen is a 10 out of 10. Who are the people that are going there? mostly white people, right? Mostly Asian people. But when you look at my district, my Mount Pleasant, there's a lot of various folks from lots of different backgrounds, but we don't have those same resources because tax brackets and tax systems don't allow for those kinds of resources to be pulled into our area. And now you're adding on, you're layering on food insecurity, you're layering on joblessness, and you're layering on the stress that comes with all of that. And that's where I'll get into the ACE aspect of this. So, so for people who are unaware, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Tool. It was a tool that was developed in the 1980s by Kaiser and the CDC. And originally it was meant to look at the long-term impacts of trauma on our physical health. So they were making the argument of if you're abused as a child, what are the long-term outputs of that trauma that ultimately lead to possibly death? So what they found over the course of 30 years is that things like childhood abuse, things like poverty, things like having to watch your parents go through domestic violence, things like high stress in your household lead to actual physical health outcomes, negative health outcomes, like cancer, like strokes, like diabetes, and like death, like early death. So what we do in our program is that we actually use ACEs to measure economic output as well. So what we're looking at right now is we're trying to make a comparison of, or we're just looking at the relationship between childhood trauma, childhood abuse, and all the things that I mentioned above, to what are their economic states as adults? Are these people actually thriving? Are they surviving? Are they facing joblessness? Are they facing long-term economic insecurity? And the answer to all of that, what we're finding is yes. The majority of our clients score a 10 out of 10 on the ACE, which is incredibly high. It's much higher, 4 times higher actually than the national average for the rest of the country. And when you look at the actual data and you look at this vetted tool, you can make a pretty easy conclusion that there is very long-term outcomes that come out of this that will lead to intergenerational poverty and further intergenerational trauma.
Thank you, Bridget. Judy, you want to talk about what you're seeing in your clinic and what you're concerned about in terms of healthcare and patient care? And I know we had a conversation about your pregnant, homeless client that could not get shelter. So it might be interesting to hear your perspective.
And before I share my perspective, if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat so that we can see them and get back to them. But yeah, hearing about the results from the survey that Bridget's been doing and seeing it firsthand in my clinic, like Father John had mentioned, Gilroy is one of the poorest areas in the county. And I have been having so many more unhoused pregnant patients, and it just worries me because I don't know what's going to happen to them when it's time for them to have their babies. And they saw on the news when Gavin Newsom came and he was saying we were going to unhouse all of these people in the motels due to COVID, and none of them were able to get into motels, and it's just incredibly frustrating. I think it also goes back to ACE things. All of this will have an effect on their baby and their baby's future. And it just is very sad and frustrating.
Thank you. And I think when we started at Amigos, the average kid starting that was kinder ready was less than 24% of the kids entering kindergarten were kinder ready, which meant that they were already behind. And so what we were seeing at the local elementary school was that kids that the reading score at 3rd grade were far below. And so what we know is that kids that are already 2 years behind, it's virtually impossible to get them up to speed. And so and again, that plays into access and poverty. What we're seeing right now in the neighborhood is long distance learning or is not working for our community. Hotspots are not readily available. Computers are not working. And then folks don't have a quiet space because our folks are living 3 and 4 families renting a house. And so I think about how does surviving traumatic experience and ongoing experience like that, how does that play out long term? And do we have any data on are there any permanent effects to that for children or families?
Sure. Bridget, do you want to go first, or do you want me to? Okay, I can start us off. Whichever, no problem. Okay, well, yes, we do. So it is different. And let me think how to say this. We know that trauma can have long-lasting impacts on people. That doesn't mean that if you experience trauma, it's going to be like that for the rest of your life. Absolutely not. And I do want to make that really clear before I share some of the data, which is that people have been through so many different traumas in their life. You can be someone who's gone through multiple complex traumas and get to a healthier place and a place through healing. So I don't want it to sound like if this happens, then it's like a sentence. We do know with kids, because there's been a lot of research that's come out in the last, I don't know how many years, that when you're exposed to long-term trauma, it can change neural connections in the brain. What that means and what that looks like is, I guess I like to use examples. Think about if you are a child, you're 5 years old and you're living in home and your parents are, your parents have a relationship that includes domestic violence. Even if you have a week where there's no actual incidents of violence, you're going to be on edge. They use this term walking on eggshells. It's kind of like you're always alert. You're always alert. Well, being on alert, so when okay, let me say this part. When we have a trauma that happens, you become more alert. It's a biological reaction to it. If you're walking down the street and a car comes out of nowhere, you need to have a reaction. You need to stop. You need to get out of the road. You need to be alert. But what happens when you have sustained trauma is people don't get out of that mode. And then you're in this mode all the time. And when you're in that mode, you can be hypervigilant. You can feel lots of intense feelings a lot, or you can feel the absence of feelings. So that might sound funny, but what I mean by that is really not being in touch with your feelings whatsoever. Not sleeping, having problems sleeping, sleeping too much, being irritable. There's a whole list, and it can lead to longer things. So again, the point is that if you're in this kind of long-term stasis, yeah, it's going to have an impact. And we have seen a lot of research with children that it does change some of those neural connections. But again, I don't want to be all doom and gloom, which is the great thing is we know with intervention, especially early intervention, with trauma work and trauma-informed work that lots of people are doing, from counselors to community outreach workers, to the work that Solidaridad is doing, you can help people heal from that. But that's what I would say. That would be an important piece to understand with trauma. So, and you had one other thing you had asked earlier, kind of what can we do to mitigate these things, just from a psychological standpoint. I think if we can realize that everyone in the community is impacted in a different way, but that everyone is impacted. I know personally, just from my own experience, and I'll just talk from that, I have not been myself. I myself have been on alert, on edge. I take care of other people through my job. I work in a school, so that's been one layer of this. I'm a mental health worker. That's another layer. And I have a family and everything. So just also one thing to remember is people are going to need a lot more care and support right now, and to be understanding. I've gotten into arguments with more people in my life that I never get into arguments with. And I've had to really remind myself that everybody is really raw right now. And that's not even, I'm a privileged person with economic and white privilege, and I just like to own that and say, and that's with that. So when you add on all the other things, it's just a lot. So I think one message I would want to give is just people to be more aware of each other, and just be aware that people are having a really hard time. And
Yeah,
I'll
I
stop
would
with
back
that.
up what Heather was saying about that. The term that she's discussing there, as far as our brains being able to overcome the trauma that we've experienced, is called neuroplasticity. And our brains are really, really amazing in that way, that we have seen kiddos who have been through extensive trauma who are able to recover, who are able to overcome all of these obstacles and barriers. And adults are able to do it even better if they haven't had a trauma history of children, as children. So things that we can do to kind of help mitigate those, and then also work through it. So self-care is super, super important. I know that that's a catchy term right now, and lots of magazines and news outlets are liking to talk about it, just in a new age way of saying, you know, go and practice yoga and, you know, have a bottle of wine. But I think that there's a lot of other ways that we can be helping ourselves and really taking care of ourselves. And something that's really important to think about when we're trying to dream up what does our self-care look like. The self-care isn't always a fun activity. It's not always something that makes us feel good immediately. Self-care can really be looking at, what do I need to do? What has to happen in my life in order for me to heal? So, you know, sometimes with trauma, things that can happen are avoidance. So you might be piling up your bills. You might be doing online shopping at night. You might be baking way more than you should and eating way more than you should, or under eating. You might be doing all sorts of other things to distract yourself, right? And so writing out a list of things like, I have to pay that bill that I've been setting aside for, you know, 3 months now, or I have to schedule in a workout that's not just, you know, sit and fit. It's actually trying to push your body a little bit more. I have to pick up the phone and call a therapist because I know that I can't get through this on my own right now. I need a little bit extra support. All of those things might be difficult to do right away, but they're necessary for you to heal. So that's on an individual basis. On a community basis, it's really trying to do this work of what everybody who's on the call right now is doing already, of finding community, finding people that we can talk to and have a real discussion with, an uncomfortable discussion at times of, you know, what's happening in our community, how are we taking action, and what are we not doing? What are we maybe too scared to do right now? What are our own biases that we need to address? And how do we work together to try and bring things back to some semblance of normalcy?
Thank you. I'm wondering, and I'll get to Carolyn's question in a minute, but I'm wondering if there's a connection between personal trauma and then also just civil unrest that we've been seeing, and how that's playing out both for us personally and then in the bigger, you know, as all of us being part of this community that's called San Jose, and how that's playing out. If one of you could speak to that. Is there a connection between personal trauma and then civil unrest?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I would absolutely say so. I mean, even in the way that things are playing out right now, going back to that point that we made at the start of the conversation about how all of us have been living under trauma since Trump became our president, and more so since COVID became a pandemic. We have all been stuck inside for the last almost 4 months. We have lost jobs. We have lost family members. We have lost friends. We have lost our ability to go outside and do the things that we would do normally. Even little things like being able to go to the grocery store, without a mask, like being able to go and check in with our friends. All of those things have been taken away from us. And then when you add on this extra piece that was already boiling and has been boiling for 400 years, and you get to a point where it builds up and the pot boils over, right? And now we're at a reckoning point with each other in this country where we are saying enough. We can't do this anymore. This has to stop, and we're demanding justice for ourselves. The connection between the individual trauma and the community is that all of that trauma that you were dealing with on your own internally is now being spoken about by others. And we are realizing that many of us were going through the same kind of collective challenge, but that we were all being silenced in a lot of ways. And when I say we, I mean that in a phase that I am going through this pandemic, right, with everyone else. However, I do not mean we in the sense that I am not of color. I am a white Caucasian female. I do come from a very privileged background, and I recognize that. However, I have also had my own trauma. I'm a survivor of sexual abuse, and that is something that I own and that I carry with me, right? And so going back to Heather's point, all of us bring our own individual challenges to this. And when we're talking about moving forward as a community, creating space for everyone and realizing that we are all at that reckoning point can be really, really challenging, but it's also a space that we can grow from. It's a time for us to build resiliency and to move forward.
Thank you. Heather, is there anything that you would want to add?
Oh, honestly, that was perfect. I don't know if I would really want to add more onto that. This isn't really from my mental health background. This is, I guess, more with activism, and just something that what Bridget said made me think of too was, I think the next step to, when you look at history, after these types of civil unrest and these types of crises in the country or the world, there is a chance for regrowth and rebuilding. And I know this is hard, as, again, just myself, and again, with white privilege, I know that this is hard, but I also know too that, just like Bridget said, all these things that have been buried under the surface for years and years, and people have been dealing with are coming out. So the good thing about anytime you have a purge, you get all the hard stuff out. It doesn't mean everything's gonna be great. I'm not naive, but I do hope that there is some rebuilding as a community, and some of our priorities as a community shift focus. Anytime there's a huge disruption in things, it can be scary and unknown, but the positive of it is systems are questioned. Things that we've always taken for granted are often questioned. And so this is a time where if we really dig in and help the community and do the work, I personally have hope that we can see some positive outcomes out of that.
Yeah.
So we have some questions in the chat. Maybe we can answer those.
So I'm wondering, to get to Carolyn's question, I think it's important to speak from your own experience, and I'm going to turn it over to my Caucasian husband, because I think the point, we both have very different experiences growing up, and also culturally, but I think there's a lot that people of privilege can be doing, and I think Stan delineated some of that in his lengthy remarks there. But I think it's important for him to, because originally, and we have lots of these conversations all the time, and also, our middle class friends saying, "But I don't know what to do," and I think I'll let him start, and then I'll finish off.
And I'm gonna actually, if it's okay, I'm gonna tag Noelani on this comment, because Noelani and I served together as part of the leadership team for Santa Clara Unified School District, and and Noelani as a governing board member, and I was a superintendent. I would see kids every day come to school with the fears that I just described in my remarks. They're literally people afraid of being deported, people afraid of losing their housing, people afraid of not having food at home when they got home, and all of that they're supposed to study and be successful at school. I said to myself a million times, I don't know how I could have ever gotten through school dealing with the fears that they deal with. And then you throw on, just in case that wasn't enough, we throw on the kind of fear that's going on right now, where Black and brown people are afraid of the power structure, and it's being exacerbated at the national level. It is literally being fomented, as far as I'm concerned, at the national level. That people are literally fearing for their lives to go out the door each day, and so the trauma just piles on it, and then you add a pandemic on top of that. So what I understand after doing equity work for a long time is that I can tell you all of that, and I can talk about the experiences of all of that. And I have talked to people of color and sat in what we call support groups of people that are very diverse, and talk with equal time, listening respectfully, with privacy, with confidentiality, all of the rules that we set up, to hear people tell their own painful stories about what they've grown up with, and learn through people's own eyes the experiences that they've dealt with all of their lives. And there I can learn to understand more fully in a cognitive way, and I can even empathize more. But there is no way that I can understand what it's like every day to have to go driving down the road and wonder if I'm going to be pulled over for being Black or brown, and have to have had the talk with my parents, and have to know where to put my hands, and pray to God that they don't decide to arrest me. And if they do decide to arrest me, that I may be dead by the time I get there. I'll never fully understand what those experiences are like. And so, for me to talk about, growing up maybe as a kid of divorce and having experienced my own, and I say little now as I look back, and I'm an old man now, but as I look back on a adverse childhood experience, that doesn't even begin to raise the needle on what my kids today are dealing with. And this is what Noelani and I have talked about a number of times at a school level. And I don't know if you want to add to what I'm saying, Noelani, but I just want to say that until we can have conversations about this, until we can have conversations about this that allow people of color to share their experiences, and for we as white people to sit and listen to those experiences, and even become uncomfortable, feel all of the things that come along with hearing those things. Like, I can remember feeling guilt, I can remember feeling ashamed. I still think this isn't the country that my father, as a World War II veteran, fought to preserve. All of these things, I can have all of these feelings. I need to be able to feel that discomfort. And then, as we would say in the equity work, let that discomfort inform me as a person. I really think those are the conversations right now that we have to be having. So, Nolan,
yeah, and I have to thank, first of all, Stan. Serving in leadership with him during my time as board president, the work that he did to make sure that our marginalized and our minority communities were heard was really refreshing. And Stan and I had long conversations about this, which I really appreciate the fact that we were kindred spirits serving at a time that was really necessary. And what I've experienced, sitting on panels in the last week with nonprofit leaders, has been a lot of people trying to tell me how I feel as a woman of color, and how they believe that they perceive things. And I think that is probably the most dangerous thing that I've seen occur over the course of the last 3 weeks during this civil unrest. I think that what all of you are doing here, learning, listening, and really with that open heart is the first steps to how you can support a community. And then the conversations that I've had in regards to friends, even my daughter who's turning 25, who's going out and protesting, the conversations that I've had is, even after it is not cool anymore to talk about this, the conversation has to happen, because that's what has been lacking most recently. And I think that for me, it was a turning point in this whole thing when, you know, Jenna called Albert and I and said, I'm going to go out and protest. I know it's dangerous. I know that COVID's going on. I know all these things are going on, but you have to support me in this. And the conversation switched from having to talk to her about masks to saying, I know that you're going out there with your white friends, but sweetheart, you're not white. And you have to be really careful when you're out there protesting. And you're going to have to follow different rules. And this is going to be a really hard thing for you to understand. And that's the stuff that Stan and I were fighting for in Santa Clara Unified, and continue to fight for in our communities. And I think that the first step is all of you being here, listening to the heartache, listening to how you can change and do the work in your communities. You know, it's what Albert and I have been fighting for all our lives. And I know all of you have too, because you're here listening. So, you know, thank you, Stan, Maritza, Father John, all of you who are on the call for your tremendous work, your heartbreak, and the two kittens, the tremendous work, your heartbreak, your drive to make sure that these communities are heard from, not just today or tomorrow, but for decades to come, so that we can work ourselves out of this, running the marathon in negative miles and catch up with everyone else. So thank you, Stan, for that too.
So I guess to answer your question, Carolyn, it's really, getting to know people and getting out of our own comfort zones and coming over to East San Jose, doing a community walk that we do with people all the time in our community, getting to know and listen to different perspectives and how poverty impacts everyday lives of people, and then just listening. I think that's the heart of the work, is just listening to people's stories and the pain that people exhibit every single day. And I'm wondering, in terms of the intergenerational trauma that sometimes happens through families for generations, right? And how that plays out for families, and again, because we also see intergenerational poverty. We're doing a really good job at Amigos in terms of our value system, and knowing that education can be the equalizer. What we say is our work is built on Maslow's hierarchy of need, and if basic needs aren't being met, then we can't ever get to transcendence. And our work is really about how do we start investing in our young people now to come back and serve in our community and break that cycle of trauma and so forth. So what do you all experts tell us about what's intergenerational trauma and how that plays out?
I'll start, Heather, and then you can jump on in. So I always like to use this example of intergenerational, and it's something that we all know about the Holocaust. So my Nana is a survivor of the Holocaust. She was in an internment camp when she was very, very young, and she never talks about it at all. Because it's just something that was too painful for her. When she married as a war bride and came to the United States very young in her life, she promptly disavowed Judaism because it was something that she didn't want to ever return to. And so she is staunchly a Christian now, And she doesn't talk about it. I don't expect that she'll ever talk about her experiences until she is on her deathbed. The reason why I bring that up is because many of her friends, many of the people that we know in our lives and my family do talk about it. And it's the message of never again. And so what happens in their lives is that when they're out and about with their children, this message gets promoted, right? Of never again, we can't ever let our community go through that again. 6 million Jews with more people on top of that, Romas, Catholics, LGBTQ folks, everyone who's forced through that mutual trauma. And they're saying proudly and loudly, they're not ever going to be put back in that position again. What's not being seen is what is happening at night, right? So what is playing out? That these folks, specifically survivors of that first wave, so people who are actually living in the camps, like my Nana, the nightmares that would come with that, the waking up every 2 to 3 hours, the screaming that would come with that, the not being able to sleep, the waking up with pounding headaches, all of the physical traumas that are the physical repercussions of the trauma that happened to us that were never treated, were never dealt with, largely because at that time we didn't know. We didn't have a whole lot of medical information that taught us about how the brain responded to these things. What were the impacts of that intergenerationally? Children that were growing up in these homes listened to these parents, their grandparents, screaming in the night. They listened to these kinds of horrific stories, and those imprints, those story imprints, were left with the children, second and third generations out. There's lots of studies out there that talk about this kind of imprint of our brain, that's what we call vicarious trauma. So it's us taking on the narrative of someone else's trauma as though it were our own. Now, when we're talking about what's happening in the East Side, what's happening in our communities, just in the United States in general now, parents are feeling this kind of stress in their lives that they may never have dealt with before. Even if they have been through different types of trauma as children, now they're, having to provide for their kids, not being able to return to a job, worried about them getting sick, worried about their kids getting sick, so on and so forth, that these narratives are building up, right? And so people are starting to create these stories of fear if they were not already created. And to Heather's point, much earlier on in this conversation, many of them are valid and true. Many of them are not just fears. Many of them are actual things that are happening in their lives. So combating that and trying to find light and trying to find space to find the positives in things is becoming increasingly difficult. But because we know that the human spirit is so resilient, there's lots of things that we can do as a community to prevent that kind of stuff. And the first thing that I would say for parents out there and for folks who are really worried about this is just to seek help, seek treatment. The mental health system is overburdened, but that's why we're doing this work. That's why we're trying to get out there in the community and inform more people, like everyone who's on this call, about what trauma is, so that you know how, if you're experiencing it, if you're starting to recognize those symptoms, and you know how to reach out. And it's not just to a mental health therapist. It's not just to your doctor. All those are great resources. The multiple ways that you can treat trauma is really through community. It's really through finding friends and family and people that you trust, and finding ways in your own life that you can create space for you to breathe, for you to find ways that you can find joy, even in little moments in your daily life. Heather, add on.
Oh, that was beautiful. I would just kind of want to say check, yes. But I guess this short thing I will add is, that was a really great way to describe intergenerational trauma. I would add on that my mother-in-law immigrated here from the Middle East and had all kinds of traumas in terms of her life, and being married at a very young age to an abusive person. And I don't want to go into all the details of that, but what I would say is the other piece I see is that has influenced her worldview, real, and it's real, like we were saying. Certain things that she doesn't trust about people because of her own experiences with the government and police states and having to flee countries. So she teaches those to her daughters and her son. And it's valid, it's her experience, but you can see some of those messages continue to pass down because she, you know, it's partially her age, it's partially the time, it's partially where she's grown up, lots of reasons, hasn't, you know, sought real healing, I think, for a lot of the traumas she's been through. And so you can kind of see it domino effect. So the other, to end on a, not end, but to say it on a positive note is, please, 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 if you can destigmatize, I'm going to just say this is one of my like things I'm always saying, destigmatize mental health counseling. I go to counseling when I need it. I've been going to counseling when I've needed it since I was a child, when I had a lot of the whole other thing that happened to me, which I think it was Stan who mentioned, now seems like a silly, not silly, but a small trauma compared to what other people have to deal with. But if people can get the help now, they can break those, I don't want to say kind of break the cycle. And so really, the more we can talk, like if any of you, listening is very important, of course. I'm reading, I'm listening, I'm just trying to be an observer as someone with privilege, but the more we can destigmatize seeking help or role modeling that for other people, I think that as just sort of an overarching thing is something that I've been sort of on, it is really important. I literally now tell every student I meet that I go to counseling when I need it, just if anything, just to model that.
Great, thank you. And Father John, just lastly, we'll turn it over to you. But I want to ask you, what should faith communities do in all of this? What's their call to action?
Great, thanks for that question. And that leads us to a couple of things. So when I think the role of the faith community really is, we are a convener of people coming together. We have opportunities to bring different folks to the table to hear their stories. Unfortunately, faith communities also have a very long history of exclusion, and especially around race, exclusion of race. And so as a faith community, we need to deal with that. I can speak from the Catholic tradition that we, as Catholics, parishes, Georgetown University, one of the earliest Catholic universities in the United States, sold human beings so they can get more land. They basically sold human beings to get more land. That's in the Catholic tradition. There have been a lot of, we've had a number of saints of color in the Catholic Church, but it's so easy to kind of put an alabaster statue or a painted statue and put them up somewhere where you can't really, deal with some of the actual pain of and the trauma. So I think that the church can be a convener of listening. And to that end, I just want to share a really quick thing with you guys. This event that's coming up, Faith Leaders March. Throughout history, a lot of faith communities have been complicit, and we need to kind of understand our silence, and sometimes us cozying up to the empire and to positions of authority have created lots and lots of problems for us. So we do want to kind of invite you all on a reflective march. This reflective march that we're looking at is not a big joyous, fun, kind of happy thing, but it really is a somber walk from Temple Emmanuel and all the way to Emmanuel Baptist Church, and that's the only place that we will really, anyone, we're all listening the whole time we're there. We have young people kind of giving at different stops along the march will give us information, tell us about how things are looking from their perspective. These are all kids, young people that are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. And then our church leaders are invited to go to listen to the historic Black churches and other people in the Black Lives Movement and other folks that are going to be speaking at the end of the march at Antioch Baptist Church. A lot of these are for mostly white dominated or Eurocentric churches, Asian churches, Latino churches that don't have a lot of interaction and by their words or their fail to action have contributed to the oppression of Black folk in this country. So this is a time for us as church folks to step back and listen. So I think that to answer that question from Maritza is really to listen. We need to understand that what's going on in our country, what's happening is valid because it's based on hundreds of years of oppression and hundreds of years of cultural attack. It is something that to which I think we have we have been ignorantly, complicit in the sense that we aren't really aware of these pieces. A lot of people are hearing for the first time, what is Juneteenth? A lot of people are hearing for the first time, what does it mean to have the talk with your kid? What does it mean to, like Noelani said, her kid is not white. So there's a whole other set of rules and different sets of social expectations on people. All of these little tiny things are contributing to an aggression that we're all experiencing. Faith communities can mitigate that by being better listeners and being more sensitive. Next week, we'll have some faith leaders on with Deacon Ruben Solario. We'll be kind of sharing his perspective on what the role of the churches might be. I'm going to invite other church folks to come and just share their perspectives. And then hopefully that will have a much more open dialogue where we can just kind of open up the lines for people to speak and to share their perspectives. So I want to thank our panelists. First of all, our amazing kind of moderator, Maritza, who in her own right has been an amazing educator, community leader, community organizer, and a tia to a million different people in the community. So thank you, Maritza, for your work. Stan and Bridget, and Heather, who have been amazing folks that have said yes to do this, and to Dr. Judy Sanchez, for agreeing to kind of give a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen, as well as Bill has done this. So Maritza, thank you for kicking and pushing and making sure that things are done, and then sticking with it even though that things weren't going the way that they should. I want to thank all of you guys for amazing contribution. I love all of you, and I think that this is the first step. So thank you all very much. Goodbye now.